Welcome to an episode of the award-winning podcast Art Insiders New York. My name is Anders Holst. The theme of the podcast is New York, with a focus on behind-the-scenes conversations with fascinating people who are making an impact in the world of art, design, and architecture. Today we welcome Roselee Goldberg to the show, who tells the fascinating story of how an art form shaped her entire life. Roselee Goldberg is a renowned art historian, critic, and founding director and chief curator of Performa, a museum without walls, a non-profit organization which, since its inception in 2005, has quickly become one of the most anticipated biannual contemporary art events in the country and abroad. Performa has reached an international audience of over 250,000 people and featured more than 700 artists at 216 venues throughout New York City. Roselee Goldberg pioneered the study of performance art with her seminal book, Performance Art from Futurism to the Present, first published in 1979, now in its third edition and translated to 13 languages. It serves as a key text for teaching performance art in universities throughout the world. So we met at the Performa 19 Biennale in a gallery space in Soho. I don't know if you remember that.
I do. I remember well. It was Swedish Concert hosted that, and it was at Jeffrey Dyke's space on Worcester Street.
That's right. I have to admit that I don't really know that much about performance art, but I was very intrigued by it and inspired by it. And then I bumped into you, and then I learned that you are the mother of performance art.
Well, let's not use that word, but yes.
I know.
The pioneer of the history. I think I prefer the word pioneer.
Yeah,
but yes.
Pioneer of the history.
I think Marina Abramović calls herself the grandmother. It's like, enough already. We don't need
We don't need that. So I figured out you're the absolute best person to talk to when it comes to performance art. You know, this podcast is, I think I mentioned this to you in one of the emails, that this is about it's for the art outsiders, really, who wants to know more about art. So you have written a number of books, and we're going to talk about that later. You have founded Performa, a museum without walls. So a couple of weeks ago, you celebrated your 15th anniversary by presenting the Performa Telethon, a worldwide 8-hour presentation of performances, digital shorts, and testimonials from more than 50 extraordinary artists who have worked with Performa since 2005. So I was thinking to myself, what went through your head when you were sitting there, looking at this 8-hour presentation?
I was quite in awe of all this beautiful work we'd produced, actually. In fact, I was surprised. I was concerned, 8 hours, that's a long time. Mm-hmm. And I'm actually going to have to watch it for 8 hours. So I was behind it. But actually, it went very fast. We have extraordinary archives of 15 years of work of artists who have used the situation of being invited to do a Performa commission to go into such an experimental place with their work, both emerging and well-known artists. Mm. And in each case delivered such surprising, magical productions that are all deeply meaningful, that every person you speak to who might have been around at the time has their favorite that they'll never forget. And, it if anything, I have to admit to being in kind of a state of wonder about how fabulous this material was, and received fantastic reports from people all around the world. But I think some of the ones that moved me the most were people who had been there early on and said, would tell anecdotes about why a particular piece has never left them. Yeah. And so I must say that 15 years was quite a revelation again, because sometimes you forget what these pieces look like, or to see them brought together like that was very, very special. Yeah. The other key to the telethon, and just jumping ahead a little bit since we're all in the middle of this extreme shutdown, was which talks about the way Performa, the organization, works, that we're such a creative, flexible entity. I mean, part of our job is to be so responsive to what's going on in the world and the culture, that I was actually, again, in awe of my team for pulling off something that could be a positive that came out of this very, very negative place. Just again to remind you, and I'm sure you've lived in New York long enough to know how important the gala, the fundraising gala is.
Yeah.
And of course, it's part of the reality of what we must do here as nonprofits because of the way we're funded. Again, Performa has always taken a completely unorthodox approach to the traditional gala, which we all know what that routine is.
Yes.
By making those events, turning them into really important events, not just kind of fun parties, but I'm always so obsessed, you mentioned before, education. I'm always obsessed with getting across a particular moment in art history.
Yeah.
So to give you an example, we created a fantastic, one of our early galas was based on the Futurists, which we'll talk about a bit later, a very early group of artists in the early 1900s in Paris and Italy and Europe. And we constructed this dinner that was based on a Futurist cookbook. We rebuilt some of the Futurist noise machines.
Yeah.
We had people, the entire menu was, as I say, based on this cookbook. It had little manifesto texts in the middle of the food. It was fabulous. One of the things they talk about is, the air and the scents, the smells of the world that we need to be, all our senses need to be in a frenzy of awareness. And so we actually had this special moment where we put scent in the air. Mm-hmm. And this, again, was all to inform, the 200 guests that were there and who are supporters, what this movement was about. Yeah. So part of the Performa Gala has been, and we're going to talk a bit more about this extraordinary history of performance that I chose to write about and wrote this book in 1979, to show there were these, to really explain what we're trying to do today, where this history has been so significant to the history of art. Yeah. And so, for example, the Futurist banquet we did a Russian constructivist evening that we called the Red Party, of course. Yeah. And everything was red. The food was red. People had to wear red. Everybody had to come out wearing red clothes. The music, everything we did was from that moment in time, but the Red Party and so on. We did a beautiful, beautiful event for the Bauhaus, and we played on the Bauhaus, did these fantastic parties that they were well known from. They did something called the Metal Party. Uh-huh. So we made our version of the Metal Party. So each of our galas has been inventive to such a degree that people wait for them and sort of go, what's next? And as I say, and for me, it's like with every bite a bit of history. I'm not going to let you get away with just having fun. You actually need to learn something. Yeah. So in fact, the menu, including what you're actually ingesting, but the menu that you're reading is also part of that history. So you literally, my job was to make you leave that very special gala evening, which can be so dull, come away going, I had no idea that this is what artists were doing in 1923, and this is why it was going on. So I use every opportunity to explain the relevance of this material. Yeah. So jumping back, so of course with COVID, forget, no more in-person galas, and everyone's sort of doing a Zoom gala, whatever. But our team decided to come up with a telethon, for some who grew up on Jerry Lewis's telethons in this country, which was a huge fundraiser. And so that was one example, which again, we had a very kind of very serious, but also very entertaining side. And then in our way, because we're always so obsessed with getting these various art historical ideas out in the world, it was a chance to look at Nam June Paik's work, who, again, for the general public, Nam June Paik was a very important artist emerging in the 60s when video first became available as a porto pack. You could actually carry it in your hand and take a movie on the street and go and show it at a club that night. That was the big switch. And Paik, his work and his ideas about using television, using the connective tissue of television, the way we can talk to people around the world simultaneously, which was turned into a work that he called Good Morning, Mr. Orwell. Of course, it was on December 31st, 1983 to 84. Uh-huh. So it was the New Year's Eve of 1984. Huh. And it was a fantastic simultaneous broadcast around the world, specifically based in Paris and New York. of all kinds of artists. And again, artists that you would be very familiar with from that moment in time in '84, which would have been Laurie Anderson, Miss Cunningham, David Bowie, just a mix of artists from all different genres participating in this event. Okay, so put these things together. We decided to let's take a little bit of Jerry Lewis, add a lot of Namjoon Pipe because that was such an important moment, and let's bring these things together and create the telethon.
Yeah.
And I have to say the response, both internally with our small team, we're only 5 people, was so sort of invented a new broadcast channel to present this on. It wasn't on Zoom. We have our own broadcast channel, which we actually established almost 2 years ago. And that's another longer conversation. So I'm just bringing you up to date with the telethon. So the telethon was both a highly inventive, creative response to COVID that actually takes us into entirely new territories. And to me, that again explains a little about the way Performa works. We're very adventurous. We're here for artists to take on entirely new ideas that maybe, in the last 25, 30 years of, art fairs and art biennials and mega exhibitions in mega spaces and museums, that you often don't get that energy and excitement that brought me to New York when we were all living in Soho and lofts were $200 a month. And there was this sense of the artist community generating really new ideas. And that, again, is one of the roles of Performa, without being sentimental about the 70s, was to say, we need this community again. We need an opportunity to make work that's not about the marketplace, it's not about a huge museum exhibition, but that really takes us into new areas. And again, that's where the telethon has brought us just 2 weeks ago, because we're really rethinking what is this idea of being, since we're all online and probably will be for a much longer time, how again do we use the screen, whether it's your computer, your laptop, or your telephone, as a place for aesthetic and intellectual discovery? And that's been what's driving us. So many parts of the way we think, both in terms of art history, the history of visual art, the history of visual artists making performance. And one of the early definitions I use, because it's a difficult word to describe in one sentence, is live art by artists, which is, in a way, an easier way to describe it. And then also, one of my favorite mottos, which has become sort of entrenched in Performa's mythology, or not mythology, in reality, is 100% risk, 100% trust. We ask artists to go off on a limb and produce work that they've never done before. And we don't know what we're getting, and they don't know what they're giving us. But there's 100% trust that the artists that we'll just choose to work with, that their imagination, all the elements will come together. And that was, again, to me, the ultimate success of the Performa Telethon, and the response we're getting is 100% risk. We had no idea what we're doing. We're not a TV company. We've never worked in television. We built a studio. Actually, Pace Gallery was very, very terrific and gave us their new 7th floor, which they're using for performance.
Wow.
We built our own studio. We worked with an art group that actually does broadcast. And we took off in a completely unexpected, unheard of direction. So it talks about, invention, inventiveness, the nature of artists that, give them a problem that they've never seen before, and they'll dive in with great excitement and huge imagination.
So when you experienced this then, Roselee, did you think about the next 15 years? Did you get any sort of ideas? Because sometimes when you see this, you could not avoid seeing this incredible amount of work that has been done and all these people. And you you feel proud of what you've done, but you also feel there's so much undone. And so what are you thinking about the next 15 years? Did you have any?
I always think you're only as good as the next one as far as the biennial. So I don't really look back and go, oh, wow, that's great. Now, so yes, you're always only as good as the next article, the next book, the next interview. You've got to pull it off every time, and you've got to do it really well and bring some new ideas to the conversation. But yes, again, I would say that it's there is always. I mean, again, the telethon opened up this area of what is a broadcast, what is the art of broadcast.
Yeah.
Since we're all spending so much time. I mean, I'm somebody who's never watches television, to the point that my husband begs me to sit with him now and then to come and watch the series. I'd much rather go and sit and go and read. But yes, I'm watching the screen, and how much we're seeing fantastic, all kinds of things that we're looking at, and wonderful documentaries that have become so important. But are we actually discovering new territory, new creative territory online? Are we using that extraordinary machine to really, as I say, pull off in a very different direction? So I wouldn't say it's for the next 15 years, but it's certainly in the next couple of years. I'm looking to really ask that question and see how we'll do that. I also have a few predictions about performance and the nature of what we're going to be looking at in the art world, because museums, everything is so pared down, and I think we're going to start seeing much more. There was a big time in the 70s and 80s and different moments when video art was so strong. Yeah. And I think we're going to see a return of new thinking about what is this métier, what is this medium, what is the platform of working in camera online, really critical time to be thinking, the rug's been pulled out of from everybody. Yeah. And again, I would say that the museums and galleries have not been ready for it, in the sense that I think digital was always, and this is no single, I think everybody was just using digital for more information, for interviews, for background, for behind the scene, but it has not been used as this really creative medium. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of that, some big surprises about artists having to face this reality that, you're not going to go and see, it shifts things in a very big way.
Absolutely.
So that's as far as I go with trying to predict.
Performance art, how would you define that? Because when I look at this, and in my experience, I've seen things that really touched me. Powder Her Face. I don't know if you saw that opera.
No.
With a lot of naked men coming into, and they were all singing, and it was an incredible. I saw it at BAM, and this Pina Bausch. I've seen her, water ballets and stuff like that. And then I'm thinking about Sleep No More at the McKettrick Hotel. I've been there a couple of times. So how do we sort out all these things? What is what, or is it just a mixture of everything?
Yes, I think there are absolutely clear links between all of them. I don't know if you saw the Ivo van Hove production have you seen his work at all?
No.
Another theater director, really extraordinary. He did Network on Broadway. That was his recent Broadway. He also did the new West Side Story, but it got closed very quickly by COVID. He did an extraordinary work at the Armory, a play on the Visconti film. And it's actually intriguing because, just a little personal story there, I had no idea. I met him at a reception, and he said, "Oh, that's you," and suddenly couldn't believe. He said, "I bought your book when I was 20 years old, and it changed my entire idea about what theater was." I was very touched, and in fact, he wrote this wonderful little sort of review for me for my new book. He said, I'm sure somebody 20-year-old, he says, now I'm 60 years old, and it's I've never forgotten it. And he said, I'm sure some 20-year-old is going to find your next book and be transformed. So that was a touching comment from somebody who's really made their world in theater.
Yeah.
And yet recognizes the kind of adventurousness that thinking more like an artist has made possible. Let's go back a bit. Again, for the general listener, what is this thing called performance? It's the, as I say, the simplest definition is live art by artists. But if we look back, in the 20th century, let's say, I think there's such a history of, already the 20th century was very much a multimedia history, of art, that if you think of films that Léger was making in the 20s, you think of the books that Picasso and his cohorts were making, and the Surrealists and Apollinaire. There's always been huge crossover between poetry, language, music, dance, film, at this avant-garde sort of on the edge of discovery always. And so not very rarely mainstream, but then, again, go back to Isadora Duncan and how she turned people's heads around about dance in the early 1900s. She went to Moscow. She was followed very closely by, again, those watching how culture was being shaped. So there's a huge history of all these interrelationships between artists, musicians. Eric Satie doing the music for production in Paris in 1923 with Picabia and again Duchamp, and these endless conversations about sound or language or the film. Of course, I'm sure you know Dr. Caligari's Cabinet, a famous expressionist film where the set is painted and made by artists. There is such a rich history, even before we get to the contemporary world, of artists working between disciplines. It's really been so long since, as I say, the early 20th century, the Russian constructivists working in theater, in dance, in film, the Italian futurists insisting, no, art is, we're going to create this new movement called Futurist. We're bringing a group together and we're having one architect, one dancer, one filmmaker, one theater person, one musician, one sculptor, and on. This and pulled together by the poet Marinetti. So again, looking at from the earliest 20th century, there's been this decision by groups of artists, because that was much more kind of way to get together. It was happening in Paris or in Milan, that said, we work in all media, and that the beauty of being an artist is being able to pick and choose and take and work with artists from different disciplines. Yeah. Jump ahead to the 60s and 70s in New York, that, again, you're living in the middle of it in Tribeca or a little bit below it, but the whole essence of New York in the 70s, the lofts, the loft living, Judson Church, again, what was going on there? It was bringing artists from all disciplines together. Yeah. So you had dancers working with filmmakers, working with musicians, working with, poets, working with different people. And, in some ways, each moment in time that we think of as being this crescendo of excitement, Russian constructivism, what was that made of? Again, artists, dancers, architects, fabric makers. It's the whole history that we could go through if I were teaching my class on 20th century art and culture. Yeah. Is about these times when people from a lot of different disciplines come together. So this is a lot to take in, because in a way you're asking, so, well, explain to me, how does theater fit into Russian constructivism? Well, okay, let's talk about that. Where does film fit in? Okay, let's talk about Eisenstein. Let's talk about so on. Where does Mussorgsky fit in terms of music? Well, let's talk about it, and so on. And we could go through each period of history for different specialists. I mean, this is, for somebody who's into music history or dance history, where there are these people are talking to each other in those inventive new worlds that then change the world. It takes a while, but, Stravinsky changes the world. Yes, people famously got up in the middle of Rite of Spring and stormed the stage and screamed and booed, but they love to do that in Paris with theater, But, and then he becomes part of the canon, as they say, or Philip Glass and Steve Reich doing so-called minimalist music, know. The beginnings of that period was also, they were a downtown phenomena. They were working in this protected world of the avant-garde. Yeah. And only much later, now if you go to Juilliard as a music student, of course you learn about Phil Glass as the extraordinary figure, or Steve Reich of the history of American music. But in the 70s, when I first met them all, the sort of the orthodoxy, those guarding the history, were not looking at that work in the same way. So again, this time lag. But Okay, to sum up that point is to say that the 20th century is about artists working in many different disciplines. And it's a big story to tell. And the museum today, more and more, is creating events that people will be slowly taken down these many different paths to understand that crossovers, and that arts communities, whether it's in Paris in the 20s or Vienna in the 60s, or, wherever we're looking at, art communities form around a moment in time, a political, social time. Not surprisingly, they come together, and there's this confluence of thinking about the times in which we live. It's a complicated story to explain, but I think I'm trying to show that artists, if you're an artist, you're not separating yourself and saying, I'm a painter and I work in my studio every night and I just think about painting and, my head is only about painting, or I'm a sculptor and I only look at sculpture. It's very rarely like that. And again, it makes it a little easier when I point out that Leonardo da Vinci also made live performance.
Yeah.
That does not mean he's a performance artist. Please don't quote me as saying that, because that came up once. I said, no. I never said that. By the way, the term performance art is really something very specific to the 70s. And it's a tough term to use now because I avoid it whenever I can. Because, again, it separates it from the art world. It doesn't show that these are artists. Marina Abramović is a visual artist, an extraordinary visual artist. She understands space. She understands sculpture. She understands the dimensions. She's a visual artist who also makes performance, but she can draw, she can paint, she can, she's a visual artist. I think, I'm always trying to wean people off using the word performance art because it's so specific and it separates it from contemporary art, the ongoing history.
So that's interesting. So you make a distinction there. Performance art or a performance artist is something more narrowly defined. Is that correct?
I would say so. I think in reality, most artists are making visual art and then they also make live performance. And I think, again, to me, that particular term really described a moment in the 70s, side by side with conceptual art, where, again, a very complex philosophical approach to describing art making and art thinking, which needs also a long explanation. But, there was body art, there was land art, and there was performance art, and there were many of these different categories that people were using to try to explain this range of different kinds of things. And it's a term that works, and yet it doesn't, because, again, people say, who's your favorite performance artist? And I can't separate that. I feel, if I think of an artist like, again, he's always a wonderful example to refer back to, and being historical, people feel safer if we talk about Oskar Schlemmer and Bauhaus, and who really saw himself split down the middle. He talks about it a lot in his diaries, of being a painter and a dancer. And if you go through in more careful detail about his teaching and the way he ran his studio at the Bauhaus and the thinking also at the Bauhaus, again, let's remember the Bauhaus was about all disciplines all the time. This idea that you could come and study architecture, but you could also study all these other disciplines. And again, this community of people from many different disciplines. So back to Schlemmer, though, he's making performances that are so much about his thinking as a visual artist, about space, about darkness, about blackness versus light experimentation that was going on at the Bauhaus at that time with somebody like Feinstein and, different artists working in Moholy-Nagy, working in spatial exploration with, as said, with objects as well as with sound, with light. So is Oskar Schlemmer a performance artist? No, but he's an extraordinary artist who worked across media and created and was a trained dancer, and he really knew what he was doing, and he was trying to think in all these realms, both two-dimensionally, physically, three-dimensionally, four-dimension, add sound, add music, add light. invent totally new kinds of costumes, invent new movement. So it's very, very rich.
Yeah.
It's a very rich story to tell.
You said something in your book here that I wrote down that I thought was very interesting in terms of what is performance art. You said an execution or demonstration of conceptual ideas, expression of an idea rather than an art object, performance as a catalyst. And the performance is the artist and not a character, like an actor. And rarely do they follow a plot or a narrative. The performance can be esoteric, shamanistic, instructive, provocative, entertaining. I thought that was helpful.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Great. Is that the big book you're looking at?
I think it's your first book, the one from '79.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Well, it is very helpful. Again, it's a part of my trying to tell this larger story, and not to settle on a single definition, but and that comes from many different things. I mean, in some ways, the easier conversation often is, well, what's the difference between performance and theater? Mm. And that's an interesting question that I go into quite in detail in the more recent book, which is, again, it's an easier one to describe in a way that, one is starts with text, it begins with words, it begins with, even when at its most adventurous and experimental, which I would say you see more of in Europe than you do in the States for all kinds of reasons, there's still a sense that there's a cohesion to an idea. Whereas performance, as it is with artists, with art making, it's almost like to explain something too clearly is to be too literal. Mm-hmm. There's always room for the viewer to insert their own thinking into a piece. So the performance is the artist working in performance is first and foremost working visually. It's a very different headset, different frame to somebody who begins with a text. Mm-hmm. Some other easier ways to explain that difference. If you're a playwright, you might not also be a director. So you have this different roles in theater. You have the playwright, then you have to find a director who understands what you do. Then you need to find actors who will perform and read the text and learn your text. And from actors, I imagine you need to find a producer and somebody to fund the larger picture. And then you need to find a theater, and then you need to find lighting designers. And then you typically find costume designers and set designers. And so what we're talking about here is a multi-division of labor if you're moving in theater. Art world, it's not that at all. It's a single artist who typically conceives the totality, conceives the idea, conceives the setting, conceives, directs, maybe performs in it themselves, designs whatever costume, brings what, maybe acquires, as work gets more complex, maybe brings in other partners, but there's still only one person driving the Porsche. Yeah. There's one driver. Yeah. And everybody else is with that person paying attention to that artist's vision. Yeah. These are big differences. I remember having a wonderful conversation with Elmgreen and Dragset, Michael and Ingar, and they said also how quickly you can move into doing a performance in the art world, i.e. all those steps I mentioned, you don't need to go through those steps. If you wanted to do something next week, and you have a really brilliant idea and you want to take over a certain space, whether it's on a street corner or wherever, and there's room for you to move pretty quickly and to execute something without permission from all these different factors that arrive. So in that sense, it's a very what were some of the other words you referred to? It is a catalyst. It can be all these different things. It can respond to, an artist can choose to respond to a current crisis or current concern. It doesn't mean they have to, and act, find some way to execute that's very public. That doesn't mean going into a studio and creating a painting, and but that has this interface with the public. So many reasons why somebody would choose to do a performance.
I like this sort of multidisciplinary collaboration. I mean, you look at other areas, for instance, in education, where you put in, students and they learn different subject areas, discipline that are very separated. And there are others who tries to use cultural history as the base for some integrative learning. And you also see it in medicine, where you have different specialists. Now, you have a sick patient, but you only get an opinion from different people, but they never seem to cross over borders. So when I look at your background, you also have a very wide scope. How do you work as a curator for performance art, which would mean then that you need to know a lot about different things, right? It's not just one person who drives the car, as you said before. You have to be knowledgeable, or at least have an opinion in other disciplines. So how does that work for you?
I love you saying, well, it's both his personal history as well as. Yes, I would say you're absolutely right. In fact, I often think of myself a bit like, the Chinese juggler that's keeping plates in the air, and they've got to keep running from one plate. They'll end up one side and then the other one's about to fall, and you've got to keep running back and forth to keep all the plates in the air. Yeah. I would say, certainly when I wrote the book in 1979, I really did immerse myself at that point in time in the history of theater. What do we know about up here? What do we know about early days of stage sets? What is the history of the stage set? What is the history of theater? Yeah. I certainly was, following what is the history of dance? How far back do we go? Where does the ballet dancer come in? Where does, Ruth Saint-Denis, what is the history of dance? What is the history of film? What is the history of music? So you're right. It does demand an awareness, and obviously one has to take pleasure in all these different factors, and trying to constantly, like the proverbial Chinese juggler, trying to constantly stay current with all those elements, including, of course, politics and society and what's happening. So it is trying to keep a lot of different threads together, which, as a cultural historian, that's what we do. So, so that crossing disciplines, I think a lot of that also came from growing up in South Africa, which I think is a very important part of my DNA. Mm-hmm. Not only the politics, which was profound and disturbing, and something that one was very aware of from a very, very early age. It's like watching some of these 4-year-olds dealing with Black Lives Matter or, COVID, and seeing that they understand it. They know what's going on. And, to grow up in apartheid was quite extraordinary. But to grow up in Africa and to hear Zulu songs in the morning on the radio, and to see Zulu culture, which was the area that I grew up, was mostly Zulu, and to not be separating one department from the next, to not see, to always see everything related to everything else and related to the politics of the time, I think was part of what I was fascinated by from a very early age. And then I was also a dancer myself, so that was perhaps my first complete obsession, and everything from ballet to tap, to even studied Bharatanatyam, which is classical Indian dance, because where I lived there was a big South Indian population that came out in the 1800s. So, and then I did a fine arts. So my background was actually painting, dance, and political science. And so to me it was always meshing. That's interesting. All those things. Exactly. So, so that was set up very early on in my mind, that you couldn't separate those things. And then, I did mention Oscar Schlemmer. So when I went to a place called the Courtauld Institute in London, which is, part of London University for History of Art. And so, when I had to decide what to write my dissertation on, discovered Schlemmer's work and total identification with his agonizing between being a dancer and a painter. And I was like, I understand this. I understand it in my bones. It was so personal to me that he was talking about something that I was thinking about as a 20-year-old. That I could really deeply sort of climb into his thinking.
So was there a time when you thought about becoming an artist in either painting, drawing, or dance? I mean, were you thinking about what discipline should I pick, or were you thinking about why can't I pick a discipline?
I think dance was something that's heaviest, but I also, again, I can say this now because I don't paint anymore, but I was very good at painting and all of that. I could do it, but I didn't see myself as moving in that. But I certainly had a very strong sense of dance and that as a possible move. And in a sense, I spent the rest of my life writing about it. What is this relationship between dance, painting, politics, the world around us? And so, and I was always, again, political science, art history, the sort of intellectual world was calling very heavily, and recognizing that it's a whole other courage or a whole other set of concerns to take off and try to be a dancer. I didn't know what that would really look like when I moved to London. So, I think those are things you're accumulating at your late teens, early 20s. You're recognizing that there are these very strong things one's obsessed with, and then they all accumulate in some magical way. I'm always telling my students or my children who are now grown, none of it's wasted. You bring it all together and somehow it comes together to shape who you are.
Yeah.
Sometimes there's that question, how come I wrote that book? And I think it is about these factors that come together that, why is it that I wrote that book in 1979 and how come that book is still in print 40 years later? And yet I still have so much more to say about it. I became director at a very early age of the gallery at the Royal College of Art in London. And to my surprise, I couldn't believe I got the job because I'd never run a gallery before and I'd never curated before. But right from the start, again, because of probably this dance background, and again, not just being a dancer, because in fact, very early 60s thing to do, but in South Africa, I was on stage doing pantomimes and things. So that theatricality was always inside me. It wasn't just that I was a dancer, but it was like the sense of theatricality. And, one of my best childhood friends was in the circus. This is what excited me about being in this animated state. So, and as a director of the gallery at the Royal College, right from the beginning, I think my first exhibition there was actually Giulio Paolini, who just had a beautiful exhibition at the Marion Goodman Gallery, very conceptual work, but at the same time I was showing Brian Eno in music and the Kipper Kids, who were this completely crazy, amazing duet who did performance. And throughout my tenure at the gallery, there was always performance going on. So the Schlemmer provided this, in a way, a real history guide to what I was looking at. So it was always very, very important. But then throughout, ever since, it's always been, again, all those elements. So, and then when I moved to New York, I was really following all the new dance downtown.
And I understand that you founded Performa to recreate some of the energy that you have then experienced over your life, so to speak. So where do you find that energy today in performance art? Where can you? I mean, New York obviously is one hub, but internationally, where are things happening? Where are things interesting and innovative?
I would say, again, that the history or what's going on out there there's a lot of performance going on. I wouldn't say there's any one place that's more than others, although maybe New York is probably very vibrant, but so is London and so is Paris. Performance is generally understood to be such a possible, such a vehicle for explaining so many ideas. I mean, I think if you look at the larger recent book that I wrote on performance in the 21st century, you'll see work there from Afghanistan and from South Africa and from really all over the world. And I would say it does, and I think Performa was very instrumental in suddenly people really starting to pay attention. I mean, one of the other reasons I started Performa was, here I'd been writing, I wrote that book so long ago, and I'm always banging the drum and saying, people don't know the history, and it is time that history. So I would say there were three key reasons. One was to grab hold of that history and say, this is nonsense. It's time it was understood, and I need a platform to show that history. So one thing that drives Performa is really, that's why I call it the Museum Without Walls, is that we're showing this ephemeral material, but I want to go back and show you what they were doing in the Renaissance. I want to show you what people were doing in London in the 20s or in the 1800s of events and how those fit into the history of art as we know it. But my book that I wrote in 1979, which establishes this 20th century history, was in a sense a rewrite of the 20th century. I wanted to go back into the 20th century and open up all those spaces where performance had not been explained. What were the surrealists doing? What did that mean? We all know that Dada came out of Zurich, and it was happening during First World War and the horrors of First World War, and a lot of artists went to Zurich because it was neutral and they were trying to get away from the war. We know those, but nobody quite knows. But where do we put this work that they were doing? They had a nightclub. They were doing weird poetry. What's going on here? And then they all go, some of them go back to Berlin, and then Berlin has this Berlin Dada, and then they go back to Paris and create surrealism. Like, what's going on here? So I feel I was explaining those parts where it was just glossed over because no one could figure out, well, what is Dada and who is a Dada artist and so what? So these guys were and ladies were in a club in Zurich, but what did that mean? And yet it totally shifted what we understand about 20th century art. And, similarly with Russian constructivists, you go, what was going on here? What were the events on the street? What was new dynamic kind of graphic that they were using? Why haven't we had this explained? And so in many ways, it's a revisionist art history of the 20th century. It's like, hold on, there's, if you read in detail, again, I'm going through very art historical detail, but, if you want to understand Jackson Pollock and then to Alan Kaprow and the happening, these two things merge and come together. And, you need to explain what happened with the happening and how that turned around the whole New York scene. The New York scene in the 60s and 70s becomes this place where artists are gathering at the Cedar Bar and doing events, and then the next generation moves to the Judson Church, and the history of New York becoming the avant-garde center is around these kinds of events.
Yeah, no, I noticed that when I read your book that Rauschenberg and Jasper Jones, Yves Klein, Oldenburg, all those people were involved in this, and I never made that connection before. You only see their art, right? But you don't understand the context of how. And
that was a nice revelation to find, and that's why I started this organization, because it's like I've been trying to point this out for so long. There was actually a moment a couple of years ago. I was at the Tate Modern, and there was a beautiful Malevich exhibition. And I've always wanted to argue, and people talk about the first abstract painting, the first all-white or all-black painting, and it's always typically presented as 1917. And I want to go, hold on. He did his first abstract painting as the set of a piece that he did in 1913. You're missing, but because it was a performance. It wasn't given its place in art history. So the point being that set then influenced his future in abstraction, and that very, very important figure as an abstract painter. And I was finally vindicated, actually, in the Tate show. There was an entire room, a large room, that said 1913 Victory Over the Sun. And it had a beautiful quote from Malevich that somebody put on the wall, a wall label saying, if you want to understand my work, you must understand Victory Over the Sun, which was a performance that he did with again, a group of artists who were musicians, poets, and so on. But that piece, because it was performance, was not understood. And this quote had me almost like, thank you. This is what I've been trying to point out for years, that performance shifts or changes, or it's a place to experiment that allows the artist to come up with things they had no idea they were heading towards.
Yeah.
And one other example, I mean, a recent exhibition, a beautiful exhibition of Rauschenberg at MoMA. And it was stunning to see how the work comes to life and enters an entirely new territory with these installations, with the work that he did with Trisha Brown, the choreographer. And each time there's a collaboration with Merce Cunningham or with Trisha, it transforms the next body of work.
Yeah.
And I loved it, actually. I think there was a Peter Sheldal review in the New Yorker of that show, and he said, who knew? Mm-hmm. You know, Rauschenberg was a performance artist, you know, and it was almost like, again, you know, for beautiful writers like Sheldal, he doesn't typically pay attention to that either. And he came out with the same response to Picabia. He said, had no idea that Picabia was making these live performances. Yeah. My point as a very strict art historian, because we're detectives, that's our job. I'm always telling my students, you know, as one of our jobs, the many, but one is to be a detective, to find who's influencing whom. And
we talked about Performa. You started in 2005, and you said you're 5 people working there.
We're a very strong production house. I mean, we've learned so much in the 15 years. You know, a serious educational environment. Yeah. We've trained a lot of the new young curators that are now in demand, because every museum now has a performance department, and so does every gallery. By the way, I'm sure you've noticed this year that every gallery now has performance. And several of our people who are trained by us, you know, for 5 years have moved on to the Whitney or to run Pace Gallery and these departments. So, yes, we need a little more. We need to, you know, there's many aspects and also a lot that goes into producing that biennial, because it's not just an accumulation of, you know, let's go around the world and pick and choose. Everything is new and commissioned. So it's really working with the artist to create something they'd never thought they would even go near.
How does that process work? Do you invite people and then you take care of the production of the art, correct?
In 1999, I was at Venice Biennial, and I knew her work very well, but I saw the work, an installation of Shirin Neshat. It was extraordinary work, this piece called Turbulent, which is unforgettable. It was in a very large piece at the back there, you know, that large space where all the old warehouses. And it was a remarkable work where there are 2 screens. There's a man singing on one screen, and then it stops, and there's a woman singing on the other screen, and you're surrounded by sound. And there's this visual storytelling about, you know, East and West and religion and men and women, and huge, very, very profound work, and very moving and stunning and beautiful, and with extraordinary music. And I was moved to tears. I just thought it was amazing. And, you know, as somebody who's been going to performances for 40 years, seen them in all different shapes and sizes, and, you know, spending a lot of time in the East Village as it was in the 80s and 90s. And, you know, you're always seeing work that's almost fantastic, and yet somehow it still has this very do-it-yourself quality, because it's not a field that's been supported, or it doesn't have a longer life, or it doesn't have a way to reach a larger public. And, you know, I was coming out of that time period where also there was a lot of monologues. That was the big fashionable thing, you know, the monologue. And honestly, I was just thinking, you know, maybe I've seen too much. You know, maybe it's time to, maybe I've just seen too much performance. It's not moving me. I'm just seeing this lot of things being repeated. I'm not seeing something for the 21st century. I'm not seeing work that looks as beautiful as Shirin Neshat or Isaac Julian, or, you know, that was also the same time that many artists were starting to work in film projection, which also had a lot to do with technology and where film was going, and bringing the projection film, beautiful film, into the gallery space. You know, many of these different histories we're trying to track as we talk. And I sat there and I thought, wouldn't it be amazing if performance looked like this? Like, I'm going to the East Village and seeing these very rough and ready pieces that have the germ of beautiful ideas, but they can't grow up because there's no one to shepherd it to the next phase.
I see.
And this was the genesis of Performa, because I came back to New York and I knew Shirin not very well, but I knew her. And I said, I'd love to come over for coffee. And we got together and I said, I have an idea. Would you ever think of doing a live performance? I think you have all these incredible ingredients. You have this visual storytelling, this cinematic choreography. You have the stories are so profound. It's so moving. There's this beautiful singing, It's got all the things I would love to see in a live performance, but I'm not seeing. I'm seeing it in your work, but I wish it were live.
Yeah.
And Shirin, in her lovely way, said, what a great idea. I would love to do that. And that was the beginning. And so suddenly I became a producer. I had no idea if you paid somebody $20,000 or if it was going to be $200,000. I had no idea. Never produced anything. And so it went very quickly from there. We took it to Mass Smoker, and I met, certain people who put up some initial funding, and we moved very quickly. And suddenly we had this work called Logic of the Birds that included, it was just my dream, what I'd fantasized, these 3 films that were made with these performers walking off the screen into the space with sound. And just to jump ahead quickly, it went to Lincoln Center Festival.
Wow.
And, and it was staggering. And then we also, so that was the beginning, and that was 2001. We also opened 3 weeks after 9/11. I can never forget that, which was fascinating because, of course, it's a Persian story. It's all about the same sort of similar large area where this horror was emanating from, and yet here's this ancient 12th century poetry that was the basis of this work. It was so poignant that it happened at that moment, and it was such a success, deeply, not just a success, but like it provided all that desire that I had for a performance that I'd never seen before, that somehow came out of the art world, that wasn't theater, that didn't have a text. It had all these elements of being the work of a visual artist, no question. And so we went from there, and actually I remember Isaac Julian came to see an early version of that when we were rehearsing it. And I said, Isaac, you're next. I want to work with you. And then we did a beautiful piece of his that we presented at Sadler's Wells in London and at Brooklyn Academy here. Commissions, are really, I had my own roster of people that I imagined could make something beautiful by instinct. Like, what if, as I said to Shirin, what if you did a live performance? What if your performers walked off the screen into a space? What would happen? Said the same what if to Isaac. And that's how it went, and it's not like I see work all around the world, but it wasn't picking and choosing. We're not presenters. We really are commissioned. And I think that's also created the excitement about Performa, that these works started, from zero, from a seed that is planted, and then they grow over 2 years into something that is unforgettable.
Yeah.
The same could be said from Rashid Johnson. Was a similar kind of evolution of waiting many years to say, whenever you're ready, just let me know. And he came up with a brilliant idea that he then said actually led him into directing his first film, because he had so much pleasure from creating this work with us that was him directing a play of Amira Baraka's Dutchman. But he chose to present it in the Turkish baths on 10th Street, and that's another story. But it was brilliant. And he said he was so taken by that new discovery for him that it led him into filmmaking.
So what is up for 2021?
I think a lot of it will be very New York based.
Yeah.
We've always worked as what brought you in was what I call pavilions without walls. So last year was a Swedish pavilion and a Taiwanese pavilion.
Yeah.
We did a beautiful series of works with the South African pavilion. We've done a Polish pavilion. Being able to go there and really ask questions about what was happening. I had a whole other idea before COVID struck, but so it's going to be very New York based. Everything will be twofold. We'll have both an online component and a live component, and we will decide next late summer which way we're going based on what's the health of the country.
Yeah.
of the world.
What is the typical timing? Is it October, November?
We've actually moved it forward. It's always been November, 3 weeks in November, but we've moved it forward for next year in case we'll still be outdoors. So we want to make sure that we have enough warm weather to get people through.
So something here that you wrote in your book that I really caught my attention, that performance art continues to be highly reflexive, volatile form, one that artists use to articulate and respond to change. It continues to defy definition and remains as unpredictable and provocative as it ever was. I like that.
Thank you. Yes, I do too.
Well, Roselee, thank you so much for taking the time. And again, congratulations to the first 15 years.
Thank you so much. It's been really great, very interesting talking to you.
Thank you so much. This is Art Insiders New York. My name is Anders Holst. If you enjoyed this episode and have family and friends who love New York and are passionate about the world of art, design and architecture in the city, please spread the word by following us on artinsidersnewyork.com or liking us on our Facebook page, Art Insiders New York, where we publish newsworthy material all the time. It's very much appreciated. Thank you. This episode was produced by UOM LLC, copyright 2020.